I recently saw Spider-Man Brand New Day, and before I even talk about that movie, I figured I should make a dedicated video talking about how Spider-Man has been treated in the MCU up to this point. Because it's fairly obvious that the John Watts trilogy, the home trilogy as some people are now calling it, is a different era for this Tom Holland Spider-Man than what is being established in Brand New Day. We are moving on from what has been previously established in the past, and as how No Way Home concludes, it's most definitely that No Way Home was the closing of a chapter, which would then reset Peter Parker back to status quo to something much more people are familiar with. Because what a lot of people have criticized about Tom Holland's Peter Parker is that it's not exactly standalone Spider-Man movies you're watching. You're just watching MCU installments where Spider-Man is in the shadow of other heroes, usually Iron Man. Spider-Man's first appearance in Civil War, which I remember watching the trailers for that. It was really cool seeing Spider-Man for that, even though it probably would have been better as like a spoiler, not being marketed, but it's fucking Spider-Man. Of course you're going to market that. The effective origin story for Spider-Man is just getting recruited by Tony Stark. This was obviously done because you already know who Spider-Man is. So we don't need to like relitigate the entire origin story at this point. But this is going to have some arguably disastrous consequences, which other movies later on would try to rectify. In Spider-Man Homecoming, you still definitely feel Tony Stark's presence. Iron Man shows up, essentially is able to like confiscate all of the like Iron Man tech, which Spider-Man has a lot of Iron Man tech, which is confiscated from him because he messes up, and then he defeats Vulture, which, speaking of which, the villains, especially Vulture and Mysterio, they are more tied to Iron Man than they are Spider-Man, which the villains themselves are really cool. I do like both Vulture and Mysterio, but there's not really any personal drama or stakes that Peter Parker is going through as a civilian that really ramps up the tension. And that's even less so for Far From Home. But in Homecoming, there is the really interesting thing where the Vulture is like the father of the girl that Peter Parker is like interested in and trying to date. And unfortunately, it really doesn't go anywhere because she's like written off of the whole MCU after that movie, which is just... It's really disappointing, frankly. Hell, the Vulture is teased to come back in a post-credits scene, but that never gets followed up upon, like, ever. And at this point of the, like, MCU movies, like, what's so special about Vulture anymore? Like, obviously, he wouldn't remember Peter Parker. So, yeah, everything about the Vulture just, you know, it exists only in Homecoming, which is unfortunate because I feel like something more could have been done there. So, yes, like, Homecoming is a good movie, like as an MCU film, but it's not a great Spider-Man movie. And I'm sure you're gonna hear this a lot from me. It just does not live up to the GOAT Sam Raimi trilogy. Obviously, those movies were not juggling as much, so they could be complete on their own. But what the MCU Spider-Man films largely felt like were B plots for Avenger films. Because mind you, that Homecoming literally opens up to like a flashback from an Avengers film, and then Far From Home is obviously supposed to be dealing with the aftermath of what happened all throughout Phase 3, especially Infinity War and Endgame, which as a bit of an addendum or a prologue to those movies, yeah, completely fine, but just nothing is really interesting going on when it comes to those Spider-Man characters. It's the thing where Spider-Man himself is not complete. He is more of a supporting character to others, mostly Iron Man. Because at the end of Homecoming, Tony offers the Peter Parker, Spider-Man, like membership into the Avengers, but he turns it down. Only in Infinity War, which is the next movie we see Spider-Man in, to basically just be a part of the Avengers team. I understand the circumstances calls for it, and I think that Infinity War and Endgame, even though obviously given what happens in Infinity War, not like Peter Parker's in it all that much, but those movies are better having Spider-Man in them because of how we feel that, Tony Stark feels losing him, and then the other way around. And regardless of anything else I have to say, in Infinity War and Endgame, Peter Parker just saying like, Tony Stark, I don't feel so, and just dying in his arm. That is such an amazing moment in the MCU. Infinity War is so good. Unfortunately, Endgame didn't quite live up to it, but you know that doesn't have anything to do with Spider-Man. That's more everything else. And after Endgame, we then get essentially what the prologue is, being Far From Home, which I do not completely hate, but still just like taking the scraps of, these much bigger, more important movies and, kind of bringing it home. And also like I do like Far From Home. I don't hate it. It just feels very filler movie to me. Like the stakes aren't all that high. Peter Parker himself isn't going through all that much. Like they're going on a vacation in Europe, which I think that's fairly solid. Like, taking Spider-Man outside of New York, I think that's a fine enough concept for a movie. I mean, if there's anything to like change up the formula, because, obviously we've already had two different interpretations of Spider-Man before even Tom Holland got involved. I will say I do really like the Far From Home suit. I know there's a lot of discourse around Spider-Man suits for some reason. I like the Far From Home suit. It's good. Yeah, but there's not really anything in particular I really care to say about this movie, because it's just a lot of nothing. Like I haven't even mentioned Ned and MJ at this point, because they're just not that compelling characters at this point. Like MJ as a love interest works, but like she really seems to just pivot in that role in that movie, which that seems to be a big thing that happens in these Spider-Man MCU movies, as we'll describe Aunt May later, because there is no signs or hints of romantic affection between MJ and Peter Parker at all, specifically talking about Homecoming. But then Far From Home comes around. Now that's like their thing, and they stuck with it for like the rest of the series. Like I'm sorry, like the more I talk about this movie, the more it's just like so just not that interesting to talk about at all. Far From Home really is like the most kiddie movie I think the entire MCU has like felt. But obviously if things are going to get a lot more interesting once we talk about No Way Home, which before we talk about No Way Home, I want to discuss how Aunt May and Uncle Ben has been treated up to this point, because for the most part they have really been pussyfooting around the existence of Uncle Ben. There has been some illusions that Aunt May has gone through so much, and obviously, and this is kind of a consequence of speed running the whole, origin story, because everybody knows what Spider-Man's origin story is. And so it's better to just like see Spider-Man as he is now, like somewhat already established through Tony Stark's eyes. But then there's no such reference to Uncle Ben, which makes sense narratively because we never see it, right? We never see what happens with Uncle Ben. But obviously what happens in Far From Home is that Peter is grieving over Iron Man, which implies that Iron Man, which Peter probably only really known personally for like 2 to 3 years maybe, is like more important than Uncle Ben. But obviously like we don't know that for sure, because like he's never really explicitly mentioned. I think like his name might be or maybe initials are referenced on a bag maybe, but it's just it's super wishy-washy. And obviously this can be said about a lot of things in the MCU, because there's so many movies with so many different characters, a lot of them being in New York. But like if you just think about Uncle Ben existing, it really kind of cheapens the whole story, which I'm fine if Uncle Ben didn't have that much of an impact on Peter, but I want it to be addressed in some way, shape, or form. Like it can make sense without being a complete bastardization of the character, right? Maybe Uncle Ben died when Peter was just too young to understand. Maybe that's the case, but that would have to be said on screen. And as you can see, when you watch any of these movies, Aunt May is like inexplicably younger than she has ever been, and only in the MCU. So what happened to Uncle Ben for him to die at such a younger age? And that's assuming there's not a problematic age gap between Uncle Ben and Aunt May. And if we're going through all these hoops, I would almost like it for Uncle Ben to just not exist at this point. Let's just say that Aunt May is the blood relative of Peter Parker. Maybe there is an Uncle Ben waiting out there that Aunt May just needs to date at some point. Who knows? Like I could see that being somewhat effective character drama, where like maybe Peter's parents were older. I know like, the Amazing Spider-Man bring up Peter's parents is kind of a sore spot for a lot of people. But maybe Aunt May's the younger sister, and her older whoever died, the parents of Peter Parker dies, so like, oh, she has to take it. And then there's some dramas like this young person alone taking care of this teenager, or child, you know. But unfortunately, when it comes to Aunt May herself, nothing really all that important really comes up until No Way Home, because they had to pivot her character into being more serious, because previously she was really just seen as a sex object, really, and played for laughs. They got someone much younger than usual and much more hot than she should be to play Aunt May, and that leaves some very obvious sex jokes. And obviously in Far From Home, Happy Hogan is like dating her or somehow romantically involved, which that is our introduction to Aunt May in Far From Home. So they're still doing this like funny shit while setting up a really important character moment for Peter Parker, which was accomplished in the very first Tobey Maguire movie in the first like 30 minutes. But when it comes to Aunt May, it has to be like 3 movies worth of setup. Yeah, for those who haven't actually seen No Way Home at this point and are actually still listening to me speak, yeah, Aunt May dies, and it's supposed to be like the same exact beat that Uncle Ben dying or normally would take, but it's completely bastardized, not only because of the baggage from the previous films, but also because that the reason Uncle Ben dying messed with Peter Parker so much in the original and messed with the audience so much is that Peter Parker was partially responsible and did not listen to Ben Parker. He was having active tension between himself and his uncle just mere moments before he died, but he didn't know. However, with Aunt May, what happens, and obviously the to explain the premise of No Way Home, because this is going to be directly responsible for her dying. Obviously, previous villains from other movies like Tobey Maguire's universe and Andrew Garfield's universe, they come back. It's essentially like Sinister Six, just nostalgia bait. Essentially, what happens is that Peter Parker is trying to cure all the villains of their villainy, like he did successfully do so with Doc Ock from Tobey Maguire's trilogy. Just by fixing up that chip. But before he can really be successful in all of that, the Green Goblin comes out of William Dafoe, and then there's a whole fight. A lot of other people escape captivity, and then after a admittedly really good fight, the Green Goblin, Norman Osborn, ends up killing Aunt May. And the reason being is because Peter thought he could save these people, which was encouraged by Aunt May, and she ended up dying because of it. And then Aunt May tries to give the same, as she's dying essentially, she tries to give the same spiel as with great power comes great responsibility. But that entire spiel has absolutely nothing to do with the fucking events that transpire through the movie. So yeah, Aunt May's death was not handled exactly well at all, but I think it's serving as a turning point for the movie. It's fairly decent, and obviously I still feel for Peter Parker's character, because that is his aunt. But it really doesn't mean much for me as an audience member, seeing how really bastardized Aunt May has been in the MCU. But what they do with the aftermath of her death, I think, is actually fairly solid, because it seems like right after that all the villains escape, Peter Parker seems to have failed, Happy Hogan's apartment complex is completely shat over. That's when the other Spider-Men show up, Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire, and they bond over being Peter Parker from different universes and being acquainted with each other. And just when Peter Parker was super sad on that rooftop of his school, that's when the other Peters show up and talk about their own deaths, for Andrew Garfield being Gwen and for Tobey Maguire being Uncle Ben. And what they all share in that is that they feel responsible for those deaths, and that's what the core of Spider-Man is essentially kind of that ethos there. there, regardless of it being Uncle Ben or not. And while I'm talking about, the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man and Gwen, I do think he seems to have been quite redeemed in the eyes of many in recent years, but I do really think it's because of this one movie, and also like, clips of just the aura farming in those Amazing Spider-Man movies. But he does do really well, and I think it kind of like, if you're disappointed by the Amazing Spider-Man, I think it's like, hey, even if you didn't like those movies, he's still done justice here, which I can appreciate for any of these kinds of like projects that decide to like repackage nostalgia. They're not ignoring the kind of bad or maybe spotty parts of the history of the franchise. It's kind of like when Sonic Generations include a level from Sonic 06, like they literally acknowledge like one of the worst games ever. Obviously in the Spider-Man context, it doesn't exactly apply 1-to-1. The Amazing Spider-Man isn't that bad. But like conceptually, one of my favorite parts is Andrew Garfield Spider-Man saving MJ and actually being successful where he couldn't when it came to Gwen. Unfortunately, the CGI in that scene wasn't great, which that applies to a lot of things in No Way Home, which I could only assume is because of COVID restrictions. Either that or this movie kind of being pushed back to coincide with being before Doctor Strange, because originally Doctor Strange was supposed to be before Spider-Man, but I guess that didn't work out. But really everything to do with the CGI, the choreography, just the cinematography, actually, that could probably apply to all three of the movies. But for some reason, No Way Home just doesn't have the greatest choreography or color grading, and that is one of like the most baffling like gaps in quality I've seen between movies, because No Way Home doesn't look good. It's a fine enough movie, it doesn't look good. But the Brand New Day movie, that actually has color and good cinematography and good action. Like, what happened here? And obviously, as like the whole nostalgia baiting fatigue has set in, people have really soured on like the ideas of obviously like these old villains coming in to fill the roles of what should be like brand new stories. But I quite enjoyed the nostalgia trip, which I feel like they actually built up on what the other Spider-Man villains and what the other Spider-Man characters were doing, because obviously like Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, they're like older, right? So like they've experienced a little more than what we see in the movies, and I thought it was really nice because we got to see some interactions between Tobey Maguire and, for example, Dr. Octopus. That was the one that really stood out to me. Obviously Andrew Garfield and Electro, where Electro was like, I thought you would be black, and I did really think it was quite awkward having Sandman be actually made out of sand, considering like that's not really how he operated in Spider-Man 3. Like, he could be full human, which they do show him as full human at the end, but from what I've read and heard, like apparently it was like, that was a COVID restriction thing. Like, they couldn't get that actor on set, so they just had to like do the CGI sand thing. And also everything to do with Doctor Strange, I know people really like, so Doctor Strange was being so stupid in this moment, that's why the whole movie, I thought it was fine, right? Like, obviously not all characters are going to be 100% rational and like, know they're in a movie with dire consequences. I'm willing to forgive like, oh yeah, he the spell messed up. And also I do really like the action sequence between Peter Parker and Doctor Strange. Yeah, funny enough, I think I really like Doctor Strange, but just never his own movies. Like, Doctor Strange is cool, his movies usually are not. But as for the main three cast members, MJ, Ned, and Tom Holland, I think they are really good. Like, Tom Holland, he's doing a good performance. I actually do care about MJ and Ned in this movie, which I really couldn't say in the previous ones. So yeah, like, it's weird. I actually like am believing that MJ could realistically be in a relationship with Peter, and everything to do with the interrogation scene, because MJ, she knows her rights and all that, she knows how to talk to a lawyer and all that good stuff, but then Ned just completely spills all the beans. I think that was a fairly funny given the setup, because Spider-Man's identity was completely leaked, which I think like having actual consequences for that is that's all right, even though like by the end of the movie is completely erased but replaced with a new thing. The end credits scene has Tom Hardy being like transported back to like, you know, his own universe, which I think is really funny considering like one of the main selling points for the Venom movie was obviously Sony trying to trick people into thinking that it was a part of the MCU, which I'm sure Kevin Feige had to like whip them saying, no, it's not. And this movie is just proving that, which the really unfortunate thing is like, unless some other multiverse thing happens, we really can't get Tom Hardy's Venom versus Tom Holland, which I think that would work. But also you do see a little bit of the Venom symbiote left behind, which it's been almost 5 years at this point. So who knows if that's actually going to result in anything, because it sure did not in Brand New Day. But as for the actual climax of the movie, we get to see like an absolute beat down on the Green Goblin, like because Peter's very angry at the Green Goblin specifically because, you know, he killed his aunt. And so while that beatdown is going on, that's when Toby and Andrew Garfield, they swoop in to like stop the absolute brutalization. And, you know, that you know, Norman Osborn does like, you know, get a jab in at Toby Maguire, which I was really hoping he wasn't going to die, which it seems like he definitely did not die, which I don't know, was the reason the glider killed Norman like in the first movie but not now? Was it just because of like the momentum? I'd be willing to believe that. But then to stop from like every other like universe like collapsing in on itself and just like, you know, Peter just fighting a whole war for the end of time, Doctor Strange had to cast one last spell to make everyone ever forget Peter Parker existed. And so that means that this would be the last time we would see of Ned and MJ. And Peter says his goodbyes. He wakes up in a shitty little apartment with you know, a sewing machine for his normal suit that is presumably not all that like Tony Stark tech integrated. And then he swings off. He fights crime with no one knowing who his true identity is. And then he orders coffee from the donut shop that MJ works at and refuses to tell her that he is Spider-Man. That is quite a good note to end on. And I'm just going to leave it there so you all will have to see what I think of Brand New Day to see how those plot points are followed up on. But I will say, you know, it is definitely MCU sloppy seconds. And obviously this is Tom Holland Spider-Man is just like, you know, obviously on the shoulders of giants, right? You know, all of his villains were either like beef with Iron Man or beef with other Spider-Men from previous movie iterations. But given that this is a fucking origin story trilogy, then I guess it's a fairly solid one. But that's only under the condition that we get good Spider-Man that works as their own as Spider-Man movies. And so I'll see you next time where I talk about Brand New Day. These have been my thoughts on the home trilogy of Spider-Man movies, and also like how he was treated like beyond that.